This video is about price controls, so we'll look at maximum and minimum prices and the impact they have on markets, and also evaluate each of their usefulness. Starting off with minimum prices, and these are legally enforceable limits below which the price is not permitted to be set. So the idea here is to artificially hold the price above what it would be if we left it to the market. So you can see on the diagram here, the market equilibrium price is at P, and our minimum price comes above that market equilibrium and holds it at that artificially high level. And actually a really common error is that people draw the minimum price down here because they think minimum price maybe should be quite low. But actually, if you draw the minimum price down here, all you'd be showing is that it has no effect at all on the market, because if you set the minimum price below the market equilibrium, then the price will just remain at the market equilibrium. So the minimum price, if you want it to have any effect, needs to go above the market equilibrium, and then it holds that price at that higher level. And the impact of that is that it causes a contraction in demand and an extension in supply. So you can see on the diagram, the quantity demanded has contracted from Q to QD here, and the quantity supplied has extended along the supply curve here from Q to QS here. And the result of that is that you get a situation of excess supply over demand. So the market is no longer at its equilibrium point. Now, there's a couple of contrasting situations in which you might use a minimum price. So the first of those is to discourage consumption of the demerit goods. And so with that, you're trying to achieve the contraction in the quantity demanded. So maybe if you put in place a minimum price for alcohol, the goal of the policy is to get that contraction in quantity demanded to reduce the overconsumption of those demerit goods and to correct that market failure in that way. The other situation in which minimum prices might be used would be to ensure that a fair price is paid. So one example of that could be agricultural markets for farmers. Sometimes we use minimum prices, or actually most commonly they're used in labour markets as a minimum wage. And so in that case, that contraction in demand is actually a side effect of the goal of the policy, which is for businesses to pay their workers a fair wage at the higher minimum price, or minimum wage in this case, than they would do if we left things to the market. And now for maximum prices, we can really do that same analysis, but in reverse. So they are legally enforceable limits above which the price is not permitted to be set. So on our diagram, the maximum price goes below the market equilibrium, because again, if you were to be setting the maximum price above that market equilibrium, it wouldn't have any effect because the price would remain at that same level, at that market equilibrium. So the maximum price goes below the market equilibrium, and the impact of that is it causes an extension in demand and a contraction in supply. So the maximum price pushes that price down lower than the equilibrium level, and that means that you have an extension along that demand curve and the quantity demanded increases from Q to QD, and you have a contraction back along that supply curve and the quantity supplied reduces from Q to QS. And the effect of that is it causes this time an excess of demand over supply. And so these maximum prices are generally used to ensure consumers on lower incomes are able to access goods which maybe might be regarded as necessities. So probably the most common example would be the use of rent controls to try and ensure that consumers are not exploited with really high prices for their rent and for somewhere that they need to live. So it's a necessity type good, and the maximum price is set to ensure that landlords are not exploiting them and not charging them a really high rate for their rent, and so the consumers and the tenants can afford to live where they need to live. Now, in terms of evaluation, the big problem with price controls is that they bring the market into disequilibrium by causing excess demand or excess supply. So in the case of the minimum prices, you're ending up with a situation of excess supply over demand. And in the case of the maximum prices, you're ending up with a situation of excess demand over supply. And that really can lead to all sorts of problems. So it can lead to black markets in either cases of the minimum prices or the maximum prices. So with minimum prices, you might find suppliers trying to illegally get rid of their excess supply at lower prices than what's legally allowed. And in the case of the maximum prices, you might find consumers who are so desperate because of the shortages caused by the maximum prices that they find these illegal black markets and actually end up paying sometimes more than they would have paid if things were left to the market. Now, in the case of the minimum wage, the big problem with that is it's likely to lead to unemployment because yes, you are securing this minimum wage for the workers, which is good, but the downside to that is that you're getting this contraction along the demand curve, and if there's more supply of workers than there is demand for them, then that is going to lead to unemployment. And the final thing you could talk about here is just the basic problem of shortages, where you get perhaps well-intentioned policies in the case of the maximum prices like rent controls, which is great if you still have somewhere to live and you get to pay that lower rent at the maximum price, but not so great if your landlord is one of these ones who's decided to stop offering up their place for rent because it's not as profitable for them anymore, and so you then can't find somewhere to live. And now the final evaluation point that you could make here is you can say, just like with taxes and subsidies actually, that their effectiveness will depend on the price elasticity of demand and supply. And so if we take the minimum price situation as an example, if you can imagine this same diagram, but with a price inelastic demand curve, which would be much steeper, and a price inelastic supply curve, which would again be much steeper, then that would be squeezed up. And actually the impact on quantity demanded and quantity supplied would be quite significantly reduced. Now, in the case of the minimum wage, that would actually be quite good because you're securing that minimum wage for the workers, but you're not having so much of an impact in contracting that quantity demanded, and you're not having so much of a negative impact and causing as much unemployment. But in the case of alcohol, where actually the purpose of the policy is trying to get that contraction in quantity demanded, then that's going to make that policy a little bit meaningless as it doesn't have the effect that it's trying to have. Now, if the demand was price elastic, then the impact of those same price controls would be much more significant in altering the quantity demanded and quantity supplied. So your demand curve would be much shallower in gradient, your supply curve would be much shallower in gradient, and then this same minimum price would be moving quantity demanded further across this way, and your same minimum price would be moving quantity supplied further out this way.